Okay, moving forward, how about obtaining cost estimates? We're interested in how long that takes, right? And what we found with the respondents is what 2 and 3 report it took at least a week to obtain a cost estimate on a new product design. So again, at 68%. This is, of course, going to be particularly problematic given increasingly aggressive design delivery timelines that we see respondents are facing within the sample. And then again, here within these bars, you can see how that's breaking out to comprise that net 68%. Pardon me. Stephanie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, for short product development cycles, it's no wonder that the product teams can't really do anything with it. But in particular, if you have to wait for a week or more for feedback on cost, you're driving to a delivery schedule. How can a design engineer really respond to that cost information or act on it? Over the course of a week, he's taken his design much further along the development process such that the cost information that's a week old isn't salient to the current state of his design. So it really creates issues having those kinds of delays in terms of being able to, act on that information to improve their design.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, and moving forward, considering manufacturing versus target cost. So we wanted to know how often the teams are considering those estimated costs versus target costs at key milestones during product development. And what we see is that 4 and 10, 41%, are not consistently doing this, right? So they're not consistently making those comparisons and running that assessment. Stephanie?
Yeah, so if you think about the way that sourcing negotiations used to work historically, they used to, the sourcing professionals used to engage the supply base. They would negotiate a 3 to 5 year deal where costs would be driven out over time, and they would reach their optimal cost and still have that, 6 or 8 year product life cycle to achieve the profit objectives that they wanted around that product line. Well, with product life cycles collapsing, and maybe to 2 to 4 years, if you're not getting to your optimal cost for another 3 to 5 years, you've missed your window of opportunity to really realize the profit you need on that product line. So, it's a real challenge for companies that aren't yet doing it, considering it, because what we're seeing more and more that many of these customers really need to hit the optimal cost the first time out of the door, right out of the gate when they ship.
Sure. All right. Let's move on and talk a little bit about obstacles to delivering within projected timelines, right? So we asked respondents to tell us what are their top 3 obstacles in this regard, right? And what we saw is since they're limited, I should point out a point of clarification, since they're limited to selecting 3 challenges, you're not going to see tremendously high percents here again, right? They get distributed or diluted a bit across the various obstacles. That said, we do still see a clear frontrunner with regard to organization and communication between design and manufacturing. So that's really emerging as the primary obstacle that's threatening project timeline, followed by essentially a second tier. Statistically, these are all equivalent and do conform to basically a really nice, solid second tier. So it's 38% supply and demand for components and subsystems, 37% a need for product certification and testing that's necessary for specific industries, manufacturing processes due to changes in design, and then late or multiple change orders. These are really the things that are causing some particular struggles for these respondents. Carlos, do you have any comments around this particular finding?
It's not surprising to me that communication between design and manufacturing is the number one problem. I think depending on your setup at where your factory is or your assembly, there is a lot of miscommunication due to the two sections not having the same network or the same systems. Sometimes the engineering department uses one set of tools and the manufacturing department uses an entirely different set of tools. And the go-between both departments is really sometimes a paper, a printed bill of material, printed 2D drawings. Manufacturing is getting there with the use of model-based designs to interact directly with the engineering departments, but it's not everywhere. There are still a lot of legacy systems that are hindering communication. It's one of the reasons why PLM and a lot of the computer-aided design systems are now including software that covers everything. SolidWorks, PTC, Autodesk, they're not just worried about the design anymore, they're also worried about the manufacturing, and they're providing tools that cover the entire gambit from design to build. In terms of certification and processing, the thing that a lot of engineers and designers forget along the way is collecting the data appropriately. For example, in the medical device industry, one common complaint in going towards FDA approval is the misaggregation of all the data as they are doing their design and testing. Engineers have a tendency to focus on the physical and the getting the results, and not necessarily the paperwork that goes into translating that result into viable data. The answer to that is that there are a lot of software solutions that can help engineers collect data and test verification along the way. It's another software that you have to introduce to the process, but it's better to rely on something like that than wait till the end and then go back.
Sure. How about you, Stephanie? Any thoughts around these findings?
Yeah, so, I think what we're seeing that it really synchronizes with what Carlos just talked about. The product design process used to be pretty linear. It would go from concept to detailed design, then to, assessing all the viability of the products, and then eventually to prototype and ship. And, with that sort of linear flow to the data, it really created problems for people to collaborate, and especially in this accelerated time to market. So what we're seeing around this is that, the organizational communication between design and manufacturing, design and sourcing, even, design and the supply base is becoming a lot more critical. And to do that, you need to be able to have conversations through the process, not just from stage to stage. But sourcing or manufacturing needs to see what's coming down the pipeline when it's still in the design process, so they can be looking at, what manufacturing lines they have available or what shifts they might need in terms of what they're manufacturing at different plants. Or sourcing may need to be talking to suppliers to look at, which suppliers can actually deliver this kind of product that we're bringing to market. So it becomes a much more collaborative kind of interactive product development cycle. And because of that, companies need these different technologies that Carlos just talked about, enabling collaboration real time as the product development process is progressing. So, it's really critical that people have the ability to do this interactive communication with a consistent set of data that's all coming from a single platform.
Sure. All right, thank you. Great. We'll talk a little bit about those ECOs, those engineering change orders. We know they're a bit of a pain point, right? And what % of them, we were curious, were related to manufacturability or cost overruns? You can see the distribution down here in the chart below, and what we find is that the estimated mean here is 22%. So 22% of those change orders are actually related to product cost exceeding target cost or manufacturability issues, right? Stephanie, comments here?
Yeah, it's interesting. So what a lot of our customers are getting these late stage changes, and it's really driven by the fact that they don't have good insight into manufacturability issues, cost issues, quality issues until they're getting very late in the product design process. And so what we see happening is a product design engineer goes through the product development cycle, he gets to the end of his design being complete. At that point, historically, is when the products were tested to meet all of their objectives, the quality, the structural analysis, the flow, the cost, the manufacturability tests. And when it misses one of those, it has to go back for redesign so that, they can achieve all the targets and bring it to market. When it goes back for redesign, let's say, for example, it's structural integrity and they have to add another flange or something to strengthen the part, then, they have to run through all the simulations again and see if it meets those. If it misses another one, so they added structure, that added cost, it got beyond the cost target, then it has to go back for redesign. That back and forth to those, ECOs.
Stephanie, I'm not sure. You're breaking up a bit again.
Okay. So the back and forth due to the quality changes or the cost changes that are required in the design process our customers have actually named that. They've called it late-stage thrashing. And that back and forth is really driven an increase in the time to market. Some of our customers have talked about that late-stage thrashing adding anywhere from 20 to almost 50% to some product design cycles when they're trying to reach those objectives. And that's really, the antithesis of getting to market faster.
That's interesting. Carlos?
When I hear the word engineering change orders, it brings me back. Engineering change orders are, they are sometimes the Band-Aid to design, right? So a lot of the times you will create an initial design, you'll do a lot of pre-planning, and you'll get a drawing out there. And when you get a change order, it's because something along the line hasn't been considered, either a manufacturing problem, either a hardware problem, an interface problem with other parts. So a lot of this has to be, to solve this engineering change order dilemma of having so many within the process, pre-planning of the entire process is required. This not only includes design, but also the manufacturing aspect of it, which sometimes gets left out of the equation. This is one of the reasons we see a huge increase in simulation. So a lot of companies are going the route of the digital twin, of making sure that they can replicate just not the build, but the manufacturing process digitally to ensure that as much as can be considered is being considered. Obviously, it's not going to answer all the things. It's still, the virtual environment is not the real world environment, and there's going to be things that you won't catch. But the whole goal of it is to try to bring down as many change orders as you can using simulation as a main tool.
All right, great. Okay, we wanted to look into a little bit, what are those hotspots for issues that are going to compromise on-time delivery, right? And what we see here is the two primary culprits are going to be the design and prototype stage at 61%, followed very, very closely by the manufacturing stage. So those are really those two areas where we're most likely to see issues compromising on-time delivery. And Carlos, if I can just get your input here for a moment.
Sure. So this is where things like 3D printing have become widely adopted and hugely successful. I believe right now 3D printing's main use is in the prototyping stage. Several companies, several individual design users use 3D printing to help get an idea of how their part's going to look, how it's going to be built. And not only that, you can use 3D printing to also test manufacturing. Because you can design a part differently with 3D printing, you can then also account for the finishing process that's going to be needed for that part. So 3D printing, and then as well as the use of CAD tools. So planning out a design, a manufacturing process, a build process with CAD tools is why it's why it's being so widely used to help with design manufacturing problems down the line.
Got it. Stephanie, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so I think Carlos is right on. Companies are shifting to these much more digital processes because the old ways are just very problematic. If you think about the physical prototypes, that were common ways to identify issues around manufacturability or to be able to use as a basis for a cost estimate, those physical prototypes can be very expensive and time-consuming. Even the moderately complex parts, may require several prototypes, which can cost upwards of $500,000. And to build and review those prototypes, it can take up to 6 months. And as you get more complex parts, that's more prototypes, it increases that cost and that time to market. So the only way for companies to really ameliorate those issues is to go the route that Carlos just talked about.
Got it. All right, great. Thanks, Ray. Let's move forward. We just wanted to address means of identifying potential manufacturing issues. And what we see is the product design teams are most commonly doing so by running through a prototype sequence for evaluation at 67%. Again, statistically equivalent 63%, doing so by completing regular manufacturing reviews. We see that about a third, so 34%, are actually leveraging simulation software for this purpose. And Stephanie, if I could just ask for your comments here first, please.
Sure. So, many customers are moving to simulation. They have to with that reduction in time to market. As Carlos talked about, going to that digital design process, creating that digital twin, embedding the data in their CAD models that they can leverage in design, sourcing, and manufacturing is really accelerating through manufacturing today. Customers are looking at simulation data at each stage in the product development lifecycle so that they can be incorporating that design cost and manufacturing feedback real time as they're designing the product. But it's not only that, it's, because they have to move faster, they're also incorporating more flexible product development processes like Agile that incorporate feedback from, multiple disciplines. The combination of the digital twin, the Agile product development cycles enabled by simulation software really enables companies to act quickly on all the digital information they're compiling. And that's really the enabler to removing time-consuming or redundant activities so they can bring products to market faster at the right cost at the time that they ship the product.
Got it. And Carlos, anything to add here?
I mean, I agree with everything that Stephanie just said, and to sound like a broken record, 3D printing, simulation, visualization, all these tools are essential now for the prototyping and the pre-review stage. My only other thing to add would be is that when you do these things, when you review your manufacturing process, you have to make sure that everyone's at the table. You need a representative from every department. So you need an engineer, you need the machinist, you need the procurement team, you need the sign-off team, the person doing the validation. And as you're going through this prototype sequencing prior to build, make sure that everyone has input because everyone brings something different to the table.
Sure. All right. And finally, the last finding from the survey, we wanted to look into use of simulation software to check for any of those potential issues, right? And what we see, typical respondent reports that their product design teams are using this type of software about 32% of the time to check for potential performance, quality, manufacturing issues. Carlos, any final comments around this?
Like we've been saying, for the last few slides now, this is something that the entire team has to be involved with. I think there was a moment in engineering, let's say history, where CAD was solely for the designer. But now CAD as a system has moved so much into the manufacturing process that every person along the build process can use CAD and simulation as a proper tool. So I would make sure that the learning curve is part of the problem, but also CAD systems are taking care of that as well. A lot of CAD companies have now gone to web browser-based platforms. So you don't need a bunch of licenses. You need just maybe a couple licenses, and then people can access everything else digitally through an internet browser. And there's also now forums and communication tools built into CAD systems. So there's a lot of advancements happening within the computer-aided design world that are enabling teams to work better together.
Got it. And Stephanie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so on the use of simulation software used to be in the hands of experts. It used to be very technically complex, and thus it was hard to be used across the product development cycle. We're seeing a lot more companies developing those technologies that are enabling the inexperienced user, as Carlos just described, by providing them sort of, a design advice or design guidance. And so they don't have to be an expert. They're putting the information, they're presenting it in a way that can be acted on by the inexperienced or the novice user. But that's not to say that the experts aren't still involved. I think what we're seeing is that, those experts are very expensive, but they're very valuable to the organizations because they're becoming a much rarer commodity. And so companies are looking for technologies that really leverage the expertise of those people who have built up the history in using those technologies so that they can collaborate and work with the design engineers who are using the more simplified products to, bring products to market faster.
Got it. Interesting. Thanks. Thanks to both you and Carlos for adding those insights. Really helpful, really interesting. So just in conclusion, just to wrap up some of the key takeaways that we're pulling from the survey overall, right? What are the primary themes, the take-home messages? First, we see those product life cycles are collapsing, right? So global manufacturers really need to identify and eliminate any potential, trouble spots here, sources of latency in that product development process. It's really critical going forward. Two, manufacturing knowledge for most OEMs is really shifting to the supply chain, right? So product teams are going to need to leverage the latest software simulation tech in order to identify and eliminate potential manufacturability issues earlier in the life cycle. Again, particularly important as these are shrinking, as we can see from the data. And finally, product costs are on the rise, right? No surprise here. So designers and engineers really have to have visibility to cost drivers early in the design process if they're going to be able to effectively reduce end-stage design churn. It's really the big three takeaways there. All right, and that is the overall findings, the wrap for the survey. I'm going to hand this back over to Jill, our moderator, so she can begin the Q&A process for us.
Okay, thank you very much, Kristen, and thank you, Carlos and Stephanie, for your comments along the way as well. To our audience, a few of you have already submitted questions, so thank you for that. If you have questions but have not submitted them, I suggest you do so now. And while our presenters are answering your questions, I'm going to ask you to please take a moment to fill out the feedback form that appears or should appear on the left side of your screen. So with that, our first question is from Andrew, who asks, products are often marketed in ways that make the design, engineering, cost, and manufacture very challenging. Should more people putting out product ideas have more technical and manufacturing experience? Who would like to take that question?
Sure, I can take that one. I think it's going to be challenged to build expertise in every single individual across manufacturing organizations. They have so many different design engineers. And, there is this whole shift in the manufacturing industry where a lot of the people who had that expertise are getting close to retirement. And as we talked about earlier, with the manufacturing and cost knowledge now shifting to the supply base, it really exacerbates, trying to build that knowledge or hire more and more experts. So one of the things that we see really needs to happen is providing technology that gives those design engineers that, manufacturing insight, cost insight, structural integrity insight, flow insight, whatever it is, in a way that is much more user-friendly, that it's actionable during the design process. So I think it really behooves us as software developers to really be trying to achieve that goal with our technologies and enable the design engineering community to leverage the information in a more applicable way that's much easier.
Okay, thank you. We have a request from EJ who is asking for some elaboration on the second takeaway. Can that be spoken to a little more?
Sure. And Carlos, I think you might have some great insights on this, but I can speak to what we've seen in, working with global manufacturers around the world. The global competitive landscape has really changed. So manufacturers aren't just competing in one country anymore. Even small manufacturers are competing globally. They have, if you just think about the airline manufacturers, the airplane manufacturers, they have customers in North America, they have customers in the Middle East, they've got customers in China and Japan. They have to build products for each of those customers in each of those markets. So it's, this mass customization that they're dealing with, but they have to achieve certain volumes to, achieve cost objectives. And so to be able to really effectively compete globally, but, design and manufacture in a way that's cost effective, you need to leverage the supply community around the world. And so what we see a lot of companies doing is they may be designing centrally, they may be designing common platforms that they leverage around the world, but they're sourcing and manufacturing in the regions that they're going to deliver the product. So having an outsourced supply base really gives them flexibility around how they bring products to market and really leveraging the low cost base.
I would also agree that product teams need to leverage the latest in technology simulation for manufacturing, for product development. It helps to solve problems sooner before they enter the production process. I think simulation is getting to the point where it can eerily predict a lot of the things that you're going to encounter. There are some examples of the digital twin have been able to show how a product will look like when it's traveling in a truck to a delivery site, or how it's going to be handled when it goes into the packaging. So things like how the cardboard deflects, how the product is going to interact with its packaging. These things are now being simulated, where before that wasn't the case. So leveraging simulation to predict even the smallest details of the product life cycle will help engineers, builders, assembly teams get a better understanding of how their product will interact with the real world.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Tim who asks, how is a product cost management technology able to help us to identify manufacturability issues?
So I can take this one. Predicting costs is a good way of understanding of what parts you can acquire and what parts you may need. Hardware, for example, is something that comes in many shapes and sizes and different types of material, and understanding how much you can spend and how much you need to manufacture something can help you determine the choices between what kind of hardware you will use. Now, I know that the engineer in me is going to tell me, well, get the best hardware, but that sometimes could be overkill. Why do you need to use titanium when aluminum or steel is a viable option? No. So it's one of those things where knowing your cost range and knowing how your final build cost will be can help you direct some engineering decisions in terms of hardware, manufacturing processes, what have you.
Yeah. So I'll just add to what Carlos said. I think the other thing it does is when something is hard to manufacture, or when something is difficult to manufacture, there are manufacturability issues, it's often as a result of, it's often expensive. So if you think of, some design engineers won't recognize the impact of something like tight tolerances. Those things will increase the cost of manufacturing, and certainly they require more attention to manufacture them. Radius on a corner, if you have a tight radius on a corner, it's more difficult to manufacture, and as a result of that, it's also more expensive. So what cost can do is, if we're identifying things that are expensive, there's usually some related manufacturing reason behind it, or there could be material reason behind it. As material prices are changing, those can also drive costs up. And by introducing, the cost, insight to cost, you start to see the manufacturability issues and some of the other component issues around what's driving that cost, whether it's labor, materials, etc. So there's a lot of insight that cost can provide that is really much broader than just, the dollar value related to bringing it to manufacture.
Okay, thank you. We have another question which goes, is outside sourcing also driven by price, overseas low labor, low regulation, low environmental controls to keep costs low?
Yes. I'm sorry, Stephanie, you go ahead.
No, go ahead, Carlos.
Yes, outside sourcing of labor and parts cost is the main reason as to why companies go overseas. But that's also one of those things where it's tricky because sometimes companies that are located in Europe have their parts actually built in America because it's cheaper than having to send something from Europe to America. So they save money on building things in the country that they end up selling them in, which is a common practice among many manufacturers. So I would say while there are definitely the Apples and the Microsofts of the world that build their products overseas to help keep costs low, there are also, and to bring them back into to the United States, for example, there are still manufacturers that build things overseas because that's where the end product will be used. I also believe this was the gentleman that asked the previous question about marketing. I think it all relates, correct? How do you market your product and how do you market its manufacturing? Having engineers involved in all those kinds of discussions help the process. Having an engineer that's knowledgeable of how things will be made, where things will be made, how much it takes to get a part across from one place to another, and how to market that idea is really what's needed. You want to have inputs from every part of the design process.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. Our next question.